The auction room in Winchester buzzed with whispers and the faint rustle of paper catalogues. Alice Greenwood sat near the back, her eyes scanning the items as they passed under the gavel. She had no intention of buying anything that afternoon. She only wanted to breathe in the atmosphere of history that hung in the air, a comfort to her after long hours in her tiny bookshop. Then it appeared. A tall, ornate clock with brass hands and a dark wooden frame, its face slightly cracked. The auctioneer tapped his notes, mentioning it was from the late 18th century and had once belonged to a family of minor aristocrats whose name was only briefly whispered, the Radcliffe line. Few people seemed interested, and the bidding was sluggish. Something in Alice stirred. Perhaps it was the clock's tired elegance or the way the second hand seemed to tremble as if impatient. Almost without thinking, she raised her hand. The gavel fell moments later. The clock was hers. That night, as the rain lashed against the windows of her bookshop flat, Alice examined her purchase more closely. She wound the key gently and listened to the ticking that filled her small sitting room. It was oddly comforting, like a heartbeat echoing through time. Then her finger caught on something unusual at the back. The wood panel was loose, almost invisible unless touched. With careful hands, she pried it open. Inside, wrapped in brittle paper, lay a folded note. The ink had faded with age, yet the words were still legible. It read, "To whomever finds this, know that the truth lies buried where the first betrayal was sealed. Seek the place where time itself stands still." Alice froze. The words were a puzzle, a call across centuries. And as the clock ticked steadily on, she realized her life had just shifted into something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The following morning, Alice carried the note in her pocket as though it might vanish if she let it go. She had hardly slept, her thoughts tangled in the words, "the place where time itself stands still." She opened her bookshop early, though her mind was elsewhere. Customers came and went, but she barely noticed. By late afternoon, unable to hold her restlessness any longer, she locked the door and crossed the cobbled street to St. Mary's College Library. If anyone could help her untangle the riddle, it was Thomas Reed, a young historian who had often browsed her shop in search of rare volumes. She found him hunched over a desk, spectacles perched low on his nose, papers spread like wings around him. When she placed the note on the desk, his eyes lit with the unmistakable glow of a man presented with a mystery. "This handwriting," Thomas murmured, tracing the faded ink with his finger. 18th century, without question. And the Radcliffe name, there were scandals in that family, whispers of duels and betrayals. This could be a key to something significant. Alice felt a flicker of unease. But why hide it in a clock? Thomas leaned back, thoughtful. Because a clock is both obvious and overlooked. Everyone sees it, no one examines it. His gaze sharpened. The line, "where time itself stands still," that sounds like a monument, perhaps a sundial or a place once abandoned. Before Alice could reply, the sound of footsteps echoed down the quiet aisle of the library. A woman in a tailored grey coat appeared between the shelves. She smiled politely, though her eyes held a cold glimmer. "Miss Greenwood," she said smoothly. "I believe you recently purchased a clock at auction. I represent the Radcliffe estate. There has been some misunderstanding. That clock should not have been sold." Alice's heart quickened. She had never seen the woman before, yet her presence felt rehearsed, deliberate. And in that moment, Alice understood, the clock was no ordinary trinket, and someone else was already hunting for what it concealed. Alice stood frozen, the musty scent of old paper clinging to the silence that followed the stranger's words. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woman. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Alice replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I bought the clock fairly. It belongs to me." The woman's smile did not falter. "Ownership is a delicate matter when history is involved. The Radcliffe estate will be happy to compensate you, handsomely." She slid a crisp card across the table. Evelyn Hart, solicitor. Thomas spoke before Alice could answer. Miss Hart, if that is truly your name, you must know any claim would need proof. The auction was legal. Why pursue her personally instead of contacting the house that sold it? For a fraction of a second, the solicitor's expression hardened. Then the smile returned. I simply thought it better to speak directly. Objects like that clock carry stories, and sometimes burdens. You may not want to be entangled in them. With that, she turned, her heels tapping sharply against the marble floor as she disappeared between the shelves. Alice let out the breath she had been holding. She knows, she whispered. She knows about the note. Thomas gathered the paper quickly, sliding it back into its fragile folds. If she knows, then we have less time than I thought. Whatever lies behind this mystery, others are already invested in keeping it hidden. Outside, the evening shadows stretched across the cobbled streets. Alice and Thomas walked back to her bookshop, their conversation hushed. She locked the clock inside a cabinet, but its ticking seemed louder than ever, as though the object itself was restless. That night, Alice dreamed of a sundial in a crumbling garden, its stone face frozen at 1 hour. She awoke in darkness, the echo of footsteps lingering in her mind. But when she turned on the light, the sound was not in her imagination. Someone was moving quietly outside her shop. Alice held her breath, straining to hear. The steady ticking of the clock in the cabinet only made the silence heavier. Then it came again, the faint crunch of gravel beneath careful steps. Whoever it was, they were lingering. She reached for the phone on her bedside table, but the line was dead. A chill ran through her. The storm earlier must have cut it, or had it been tampered with? Downstairs, a floorboard creaked. Alice's pulse hammered. She slipped on her dressing gown and crept to the landing. Moonlight spilled through the front window, catching the outline of a figure moving inside her bookshop. Before she could cry out, a hand gripped her shoulder. She almost screamed, but Thomas's whisper cut through the darkness. It's me. I heard something too. Stay quiet. Together, they crouched at the top of the stairs, watching. The intruder was dressed in black, his face obscured by a scarf. He moved with purpose, heading straight for the cabinet where the clock was locked away. Thomas clenched his jaw. He knows exactly what he's looking for. The man produced a small tool from his pocket and began working at the cabinet lock. The faint scrape of metal on metal made Alice's skin prickle. In moments, the door clicked open. The intruder lifted the clock carefully, as though aware of its worth. But then he paused, tilting it in the moonlight, searching. He tapped the back panel with his knuckle, then muttered something under his breath. He knows about the hidden note, Alice whispered. Suddenly, the man froze. His head jerked upward, as though sensing he was being watched. Without warning, he dropped the clock back into the cabinet and bolted for the door, vanishing into the shadows of the street outside. Alice gripped the banister, her knees weak. The cabinet door still hung open, the clock inside ticking louder than ever. But the intruder hadn't come just to steal it. He had been searching for something more, and it wasn't finished yet. Morning came pale and restless. Alice had barely slept, the image of the intruder replaying in her mind. She brewed a pot of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. Thomas sat opposite her, the note unfolded between them on the kitchen table. We can't wait for them to come again, he said firmly. The clue, where time itself stands still, we need to follow it. Before they do. Alice nodded, though dread twisted in her stomach. But where do we even begin? Thomas tapped the faded words thoughtfully. There was an estate outside Winchester. Ashcombe Manor. Abandoned since the 19th century. It had gardens famous for their sundials. If any place fits, it is there. By noon, they were on a narrow lane that wound into the countryside. The manor soon appeared, a ruin of ivy-covered stone and broken windows, standing silent against the sky. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that clings to places long forgotten. They crossed the iron gates, rusted but still imposing, and followed a weed-choked path until they reached what remained of the gardens. Among the fallen statues and crumbling fountains stood a sundial, its stone cracked yet defiant. Alice brushed away moss from its surface. The gnome's shadow was fixed, unchanging, though the sun glared brightly above. It was as if time had indeed stopped there. Then Thomas noticed it, a small engraving near the base, half buried in soil. Letters weathered but still decipherable, Radcliffe. Alice's heart raced. This is it. The place the note meant. But before they could search further, a sound cut through the stillness, the crunch of footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate. Alice turned, and her breath caught. Evelyn Hart stood at the garden's edge, flanked by two men in dark coats. Her voice carried smoothly across the ruins. I warned you, Miss Greenwood. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing. The air in the ruined garden grew heavy, as though the stones themselves held their breath. Evelyn Hart walked forward with calm authority, her two companions moving like shadows beside her. Alice instinctively stepped closer to Thomas, her pulse drumming in her ears. What do you want? She demanded, though her voice wavered. Evelyn's smile was thin. What I have always wanted. The clock, the note, and the trail you have so kindly uncovered for us. You see, Miss Greenwood, the Radcliffe family's history is not meant for curious hands. It is delicate. Thomas squared his shoulders. You mean dangerous? You wouldn't be here otherwise. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, as though amused. Dangerous to the wrong people, yes. Which is why it must remain hidden. She raised a gloved hand, and one of the men stepped forward. You will give me the note, and then you will forget Ashcombe Manor ever existed. Alice clutched the folded paper tighter in her fist. And if I refuse? Evelyn's eyes hardened. Then you will learn why the Radcliffes were feared as much as they were admired. The garden fell silent but for the caw of distant crows. Thomas placed a steadying hand on Alice's arm and whispered, Trust me. Then, louder, he said, if the Radcliffes wished their secrets buried, why leave a clue at all? Why hide words in a clock where someone was bound to find them? For the first time, Evelyn faltered. A flicker of unease crossed her face, quickly masked. You don't understand what you meddle with. Alice's gaze dropped to the sundial, its cracked stone etched with the Radcliffe name. Her fingertips brushed the base, and she felt a hollow seam. Something was hidden inside. Before she could react, Evelyn's voice snapped, sharp as glass. Take it from her. The two men moved swiftly across the gravel. Alice stumbled back, clutching the note, as Thomas stepped in front of her. The clash was inevitable, and in that moment, Alice realized the sundial itself might hold the very secret they all sought. The sea roared below the cliffs of white stone, the tide battering against jagged rocks. Margaret and Samuel pressed on, following the narrow path that led down towards the base. Clouds gathered above them, the air heavy with the scent of salt and rain. Margaret's lantern flickered in the wind, its glow throwing restless shadows on the cliff face. There, Samuel whispered, pointing. Carved into the rock, half hidden by seaweed and moss, was a door of ancient oak bound with iron. It looked as though no hand had touched it in centuries. Margaret's heart quickened. She remembered the words in the journal, the true heir shall pass through the stone and claim what was denied. With trembling hands, she pushed. The door groaned but yielded, releasing a gust of cold air that smelled of earth and time. They stepped into darkness, their lantern casting a faint circle of light upon a winding staircase spiraling downwards. The further they descended, the quieter the world became, as if the sea itself had been silenced. At the bottom lay a chamber cut from solid stone, its walls etched with strange markings that gleamed faintly in the lantern light. In the center stood a chest of blackened wood, its surface carved with the same crest Margaret had seen in her late husband's study. She reached for the latch, but before her fingers could touch it, a voice echoed from behind. "You were not meant to find this." Margaret froze. In the doorway stood Edmund Harwood, his face pale in the lantern glow, his eyes glinting with triumph and malice. The chamber felt smaller, the air tightening around her. Samuel stepped closer, protective, but Edmund's smile deepened. "You think you've uncovered the truth," he sneered. "But it was I who led you here. And now, you shall see why the secrets of Whitestone should have remained buried." The lantern's flame guttered, plunging the chamber into a trembling half-darkness as Edmund stepped forward, his hand reaching for something concealed beneath his cloak. The night at Ravenswood Manor was eerily still. A heavy silence pressed against the walls, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the drawing room. Margaret stood by the window, her hand clutching the folded letter Eleanor had left behind, the one that revealed the tangled truth about James's past and the secret that had bound the house in shadows for so long. Oliver sat by the fire, his face pale but his eyes alight with something Margaret had not seen in weeks: relief. The false claimants had been unmasked, their lies collapsing in the court like a house of cards. Yet the taste of victory was bittersweet, for it came at the cost of painful revelations and broken trust. Beatrice and the treacherous solicitor were behind bars, their arrogance stripped away. But Ravenswood itself seemed to mourn, its corridors echoing with the memories of deceit and betrayal. Margaret knew the house was no longer theirs to keep. The grand halls had become a prison of the past, and to stay would mean never escaping its ghosts. The morning sun spilled over the hills of Sussex as Margaret and Oliver loaded their modest belongings into the carriage. The air was sharp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. As the wheels turned on the gravel drive, Margaret cast one last glance at the manor, its stone walls glowing faintly in the dawn. It stood proud yet silent, a monument to secrets now laid bare. Their journey took them westward, towards the city of Bath, where narrow streets curved around crescents of golden stone. The bustling markets and the sound of church bells felt like a world apart from Ravenswood's haunted silence. Oliver leaned out of the carriage window, his laughter light and unburdened, and Margaret felt her heart ease for the first time in months. Though they had left behind wealth and grandeur, what they carried with them was far greater: a chance at freedom, and the promise of a life built not on lies or betrayal, but on truth. The shadows of Ravenswood would linger in memory, but here, in the rising light, Margaret and Oliver found something the manor had long denied them.